Andrew R. Wilson is Professor of Strategy and Policy at the United States Naval War College. Before joining the Naval War College faculty, he taught Chinese history at both Wellesley and Harvard. He is the author of numerous articles on Chinese military history, Chinese sea power, Sun Tzu's Art of War, as well as the Chinese diaspora. He is also the author and editor of 2 books on Chinese overseas, Ambition and Identity, Chinese Merchant Elites in Colonial Manila, 1885 to 1916, and the Chinese in the Caribbean. Recently, he's been involved in co-editing a volume entitled China's Future Nuclear Submarine Force, another volume entitled War and Virtual War, and is completing a new translation of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Among his other duties at the Naval War College, Dr. Wilson is a founding member of the China Marine Studies Institute. He's a graduate of University of California, Santa Barbara, and received his doctorate in history and East Asian languages from Harvard. He's also currently working on a maritime history of the Ming Dynasty. It is great pleasure that I introduce Professor Wilson.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank Alan and Colonel Herbert for inviting me to this, and also for the opportunity to discuss a topic as vast and as broad as war and the East. I also have to apologize, I'm a little congested today, so if I start to sneeze, please forgive me. Okay, the first question is why? Why teach the military history of Asia, South Asia, East Asia, or the Middle East? And I could be flippant and say, the George Mallory answer, because it's there. So why not? But you guys need more ammunition to go back and get the resources and time dedicated to that. The first rationale is the scale and the scope. We're dealing with half the world and a history that goes back 5,000 years. Moreover, since Asian states have historically been far larger in terms of population, area, and much more bureaucratic than Western states, they were able to wage war on a scale inconceivable in the West until the modern era. To give you an example, in the 11th century, China's Song dynasty fought 2 wars against their Tongan neighbors in the Ordos region, in what is now Gansu province in China. In the first Sino-Tongan War of 1038 to 1044, the Chinese deployed 1.25 million troops against their Tongan foes, who had about 825,000. In a second war in the 1080s, close to 1 million Song troops drove deep into the Ordos before their elaborate logistical train was interdicted by Tongan cavalry, and they were forced to withdraw in disorder, losing some 600,000 casualties in the campaign. Now, this resonates more with Napoleon's 19th century debacle in Russia than it does with, say, William the Conqueror's 7,000-man invasion of England in 1066. Therefore, in Asia, you see states and military leaders dealing with the political, strategic, operational, tactical, logistical problems, questions that have been the obsession of Western statesmen and commanders since the 18th century. I'm not going to say that the Asian experience with military history predicts the Western, but at least it anticipates critical elements of it, and the compare and contrast is quite fascinating. Second rationale. It's important to look at the East as more than simply a venue for the West's wars. British wars of imperialism and colonization in South Asia and East Asia, the peripheral theaters in the Great War, the Asian theater in the Great War, the China-Burma-India theater and the Pacific theater in the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam as subsets of the Cold War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq today. I prefer to look at war in the East as an indigenous phenomenon. And also look at the diversity of military cultures and traditions. Now, obviously, I got to diverge a little bit of that from as I get to the more modern era and I start to talk about Imperial Japan. But if we look at war as an indigenous experience in Asia, it's important. It will prevent us from lapsing into cliches. You don't want to simply see war in Asia as one type of war. There's many types of war. Nor do you want to see it as maybe even the antithesis of the Western way of war. My final rationale goes beyond the value of history for history's sake. And that deals with the contemporary dynamism of Asia. Asia is beginning to permeate our collective consciousness. Your students are members of the Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh generation, okay? They are, the video games, the anime that they watch, they know this stuff. And they probably want to learn more about it. So that's the pop culture aspect of it. You also see a military dynamism in Asia that seems to be lacking elsewhere in the world. The United States has shifted its assets decisively from the west to the east. I know Bob Kaplan had a recent piece in the New York Times highlighting this. Paul Kennedy from Yale also had a piece highlighting this. As European states seem to be rushing towards demilitarization, you have actual arms races going on in East Asia. Finally, issues such as the war in Iraq, Central Asia, the rise of China, India, the future of Japan, and the resolution, hopefully peaceful, of the Korean standoff will be defining events of the 21st century. And I think your students will be well served if they can judge if those events will be resolved along trajectories that match those of the West, or follow one particular Asian model, one of the maybe the models I talk about today, or some combination thereof. Okay, that's the why. How? Well, 5,000 years, half the globe. I can't talk about it, so all of that, so I'm going to talk about three distinct models that demonstrate the diversity of the Asian strategic and military tradition, and because each has their own hook to grab the attention of the students. I hope it will grab the attention of students. The first is the Chinese model of the agrarian warring state, typified in Sun Tzu's Art of War. The second is the predatory steppe nomad, exemplified by the Mongols of the 12th and 13th centuries. And lastly is the role that Bushido, the way of the warrior, played in the rise and fall of Imperial Japan. Now, obviously there's things I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about war in the Levant, Persian or Ottoman warfare, war in South Asia. I'm not an expert in those fields. I'm also not going to talk about riverine and maritime warfare in East Asia and Southeast Asia. I'm also not going to talk about obvious topics like the Great Wall of China. I think you considered Arthur Waldron for this, so I'm not going to step on his territory. Arthur Waldron has written one of the best books on the Great Wall of China. I'm also going to give short shrift to some of my favorites. I'm not going to talk about the Imjin War of the 1590s between Japan and China over Korea. I'm not going to talk about Mao Zedong's strategic theories. I'm not going to talk about the Chinese Civil War, the stuff I actually teach at the Naval War College. But if you want to raise those questions in the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer them. Okay. Looking first at the Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu's Art of War, even for the complete military history novice, this book is probably going to resonate. It is the most widely read and frequently quoted, usually misquoted, work of strategic theory out there. It's required reading in military academies, staff colleges, business schools. It has been quoted. Actually, it's spawned also an entire cottage industry of pop strategy manuals, arguing the Sun Tzu's relevance to business, to sports, even to romance. I'm not making that up. There's actually a book on Sun Tzu and the Art of Romance. It's quoted in lots of films. It's been invoked in TV shows as varied as CSI, The Simpsons. Xena Warrior Princess had a 2-part episode devoted to it. And when Tony Soprano mentioned it, Amazon sold out the next day. Unfortunately, the show is over, so when my translation comes out, we'll try to work something out, marketing schemes. Anyway, the Sun Tzu first appears in the midst of China's warring states period, from the 5th century to the 3rd century BC. It actually comes up around 320 BC. In the context of the rise of states, large and lethal enough to compete for mastery over all of ancient China. This is essentially a cage match going on, and one state is going to triumph over all. It's also an era of revolutionary military, technological change, and agricultural and demographic change. You also see changes in the social structure of warfare. As the crossbow becomes much more widely distributed and becomes part of mass infantry warfare, this begins to displace the chariot on the field of battle. As that happens, aristocratic institutions, the basis of chariot warfare, start to break down. Moreover, the crossbow cannot achieve its full military potential, tactical potential, And armies like the one depicted in the tomb of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, you might have seen the great terracotta army. An army like that is inconceivable until new social roles are created, new organizations are invented. The author of the Sun Tzu is actually inventing what we would call the general, the professional military commander, not the aristocratic general of the past. And providing the conceptual framework within which the military technology and organization of its day can reach its full lethal potential. This trend was in turn impossible without the increasing bureaucratization of the state, making the warring state capable of systematic and sustained exploitation of manpower and materiel. As war becomes more lethal, it also becomes more expensive. The military becomes the most critical tool to enhance the wealth and power of the state, but it's also the greatest drain on the state's resources. And this is what the Sun Tzu is all about. But what's going on? You would think that all these rapid technological and social changes would drive a reconsideration of strategic culture. But that's not what's going on when the Sun Tzu appears. In fact, old aristocratic virtues and old aristocratic norms of military leadership are in fact being reinforced. And the Sun Tzu is an argument against that fundamental contradiction in ancient China. And you can see this in the explicit anti-heroic bent. I quote, "To achieve 100 victories in 100 battles is not the supreme excellence. To reject battle and yet force the submission of the enemy's troops, that is the supreme excellence." For the aristocratic hero, victory without bloodshed precluded a display of his martial valor, a demonstration of his social status. It subverted the reason for taking up arms in the first place. The cost of this new way of war, the cost of protracted war, the cost of the new military, of logistics, also accounts for the Sun Tzu's very stark, even hyper-rational cost-benefit calculations. The entire second chapter is about the costs of war. It begins, the way of employing the military is this. For 1,000 fast chariots, 1,000 leather carriages or logistics wagons, 100,000 sashes and suits of armor, the transport and provisions for 1,000 li. Then total expenses, the employ of liaisons and ambassadors, glue and lacquer, contributions for chariots and armor, amount to 1,000 pieces of gold a day. This is what is required to raise an army of 100,000 men. Later in the book, if it does not profit the state, do not deploy your armies. If the objective cannot be seized, do not give battle. Passages like that might remind us of the old saw that Alan just paraphrased, that amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. But it goes far beyond that particular maxim. It gets to the point that the Sun Tzu is an argument. And reading a text like the Sun Tzu, both as an historical artifact and as a response to a certain set of historical conditions, makes it a much more interesting book. It's a great teaching tool, but it also makes this book, which usually comes across as buy low, sell high, completely useless axioms, makes it much more interesting. And also encourages students to see, if you take one work of strategic theory and see it as an argument or a polemic, to see Thucydides as an argument, to see Machiavelli's Prince as an argument, to see our Declaration of Independence as an argument, makes the students more critical readers. Also, it forces them to judge the validity or utility of this particular argument, either historically or in the contemporary world. Everybody wants to tell you the Sun Tzu has, Basil Littlehart was a big fan of it, concentrated essence of the conduct of war. But is it really? Did it actually serve Chinese states particularly well? Seeming a strategy manual written in a period of symmetrically matched agrarian states fighting within a relatively homogeneous cultural sphere. Did that prepare the Chinese for their wars against the steppe nomads, like the Mongols, who seem to operate in a completely different strategic tradition? Turning to the Mongols, if the Chinese model is that of an agrarian state, able to wage war on this massive scale because of its incredible peacetime productivity, the Mongols seem the exact polar opposite. The horse nomads don't produce much. Therefore, they go to war for profit. War is an end in itself. This dichotomy is frequently reinforced in the historical records of the victimized, peaceful agrarian states out there. Mongols and horse nomads tend not to write a lot of history. They got other stuff to do. So most of our history comes from these victimized societies that characterize the Mongols as this barbaric other. A quotation attributed to Genghis Khan from the Persian histories, and you might have heard it paraphrased by Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian, goes this way. I'm not making that up, it is. The greatest pleasure in life is to vanquish your enemies and chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth and see those dear to them bathed in tears, to ride their horses and clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. The stark contrast between Mongol ruthlessness and the Sun Tzu's hyper-rationality makes for a great teaching point. And let's face it, Mongols are really cool. It's a great story, but rather than purely a barbaric aberration, the Mongols are in fact the culmination of a long-standing historical strategic military tradition in Asia that competed with and complemented the agrarian tradition that we see in the Sun Tzu. There have been many rulers of China who acted more like mounted warlords than the Confucian bureaucrats we assume them to be. The part Turkic founders of the Tang dynasty of the 7th century acted very much like horse nomads, acted like warlord generals. Maybe they were ethnically inclined to do so. The Manchu aristocrats of the Qing dynasty of the 17th century probably were ethnically inclined to do this. But even so, we see the founders of the Ming dynasty, who are pure-blooded Han Chinese, taking a lot of cues from their Mongol predecessors and foes. So it's not an exclusive model in and of itself, and you see a mixing a lot of them. But in addition to being the apotheosis of the nomad models, the Mongols of the 12th and 13th centuries, especially under Genghis and his immediate successors, fundamentally changed world history. It is an Asian military force that changes world history. At the height of their power, Mongol Khanates ruled from the South China Sea to the Black Sea and from the Russian steppe to the Persian Gulf. This opened unprecedented trade, technology transfers, and intellectual exchanges between East and West. We must balance that also against the destructive impact of the Mongols, the looting and destruction of the great centers of culture, trade, and learning in medieval Asia. The Mesopotamian campaign of 1257-58, commanded by Genghis' grandson, Hulagu Khan, devastated Mesopotamia and reduced once brilliant Baghdad to a physical and cultural ruin. Now, if you think history doesn't matter, you might not know this. There's actually a Mongolian contingent serving in Iraq, supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I have it on good information, and this is not a rumor. It's substantiated by a friend of mine who served there. They've made up T-shirts showing a pile of skulls, the famous pile of skulls from the sack of Baghdad, with the words, "We're back," underneath. What I find really interesting about the Mongols is both the immensity of their offensive military power, but also the innate fragility of the system, and the two work together. The fractious nature of the steppe tribes meant that only an individual, your aristocratic history, Carl, an individual of immense charisma, bureaucratic, organizational, and military genius could build and lead what a steppe historian Joseph Fletcher has called the supra-tribal polity, to cohere the Mongols into a unified political military entity. A subplot of this, and here's where you get the democratic history, is the environmental story. There's a downturn in global temperatures at the end of the 12th century, which adversely affects the Mongols' traditional pasture lands, creating a sense of crisis that helps Genghis unify the tribes, but also spurs them outward on their destructive campaigns. Genghis succeeded in breaking down tribal barriers enough to lead the Mongols as a coherent, strategic, and political entity. But the continued loyalty and support of his subordinates required constant expansion. Moreover, given the personalistic nature of the Mongol system and also the predilection for bloody succession crises, The death of the great Khan, Genghis in 1227, his son Ugadai in 1241, tended to sap some of the momentum as the princes turned away from the business of conquest. And this happens in 1241, probably saves Western Europe, and turns them back to the succession crises, to infighting. Surprisingly, however, many of the institutions that Genghis created to cohere this entity survived long after his death. So the question is not why the Mongol moment was so brief, but then again, why it lasted so long. Centuries in some places. One of the reasons for that might lie in the Mongols' cosmopolitanism. Now, given their brutal reputation, it's difficult to imagine the Mongols as cosmopolites. But if you had some talent, military, technological, artistic, the Mongols didn't care about your race or religion. They simply co-opted you into it, and they learned a lot of lessons. It was a very nimble organization, and that might explain why they endured so long. A final cautionary tale about the Mongols is the speed with which such a destructive and world-changing force coalesced in a backward corner of the world amongst a people best known for their tribal infighting and divisiveness. Turning finally to the story of the way of the warrior and the rise and fall of Imperial Japan, what I like about the modern history of Japan is that it shows that states can choose their strategic culture, their martial culture, their military inclinations. And those choices are fraught with both danger and opportunity. The forced opening of Japan in the 1850s coincided with revolutions in Western state-making and a Western revolution in military affairs. Japan's oligarchy in the Meiji period, called the Genro, concluded that a unified state and society were key to national survival. They took up various European models to expand the reach of the state, to improve its extractive capabilities, to rationalize the fiscal structure, to create a national education system. But also, they were seeking self-consciously to make this a modern Japanese state. Critical in this was the invention of modern Japan is the military. In terms of the mechanics, it was French and later Prussian models that served as sort of the organizational blueprint for the Japanese Army, the British Navy for the Japanese Navy. But for the Japanese element, the Genro invoked this concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Now, historically, Japanese warfare has been both highly ritualistic and also incredibly bloody. Japan in the pre-modern era is also a feudal society with a clearly articulated hierarchy of castes. Beneath the great families are the samurai, whose elevated status and privilege were based on their possession and use of martial skill. Ideally, the conduct of the samurai, including everything from dress and bearing to strictures on honor and shame, were to be in accord with the way of the warrior. These notions permeated high culture and popular literature in pre-modern Japan, with tales of heroic and often suicidal loyalty and honor, exemplified by legends like the 47 Ronin, these masterless samurai who get revenge for the murder of their master, but all die in the process. In the late 19th century, the Genro used these cultural models to imbue the new Japanese military with a sense of cohesion and loyalty to the new Japanese state, and particularly to the emperor, the embodiment of the Japanese state. But rather than being the sole province of the samurai, this was to be the way of all Japanese warriors, from the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors from 1882. The soldier and sailor should consider loyalty their essential duty. A soldier or sailor in whom the spirit is not strong, however skilled in art or proficient in science, is a mere puppet. A body of soldiers or sailors wanting in loyalty is no better than a rabble. Bear in mind that duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. Never, by failing in moral principle, fall into disgrace and bring dishonor upon your name. It is worth noting, ironically, that much of the literature on Bushido, especially the classic Miyamoto Musashi's The Book of Five Rings, which is widely available in translation, was produced during the peaceful Tokugawa period, much of it in the 17th century after the Tokugawa unification. As the pre-Tokugawa generation of samurai faded, their successors were hard-pressed to justify their exalted role in society. They took nostalgia and idealism to almost ridiculous extremes. Their literature idealized samurai conduct and hardened the expectations of what constituted valor and honor. In other words, by adopting this literature as their model, the Genro of the Meiji period were trying to render the exemplary ordinary and the ideal real. Nonetheless, the animus that this imparted to the new Japanese military served it very well in its early wars of empire, although not to the extent that some would claim. A fanatical devotion to the emperor spurred the Japanese army to victory in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, and then again in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Both wars fought against much larger adversaries, in which moral forces, as Clausewitz would call them, needed to play a tremendous role. Yet in both of these wars, those moral forces, the passion of the military, their fanatical loyalty to the emperor, remained subordinated to good strategy and political oversight. In some ways, they're masterpieces of balancing the Clausewitzian trinity. Nonetheless, there are some hints of the self-destructive course that Japanese martial culture would take, even in these early wars. A hero of both was General Nogi Marisuke. Nogi was one of the most brilliant, capable, widely educated, very cosmopolitan guy. A hero of both of these wars. But despite his professional success, Nogi was haunted by the loss of his regimental flag in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. That flag had been a personal gift of the emperor to the regiment. Anyone ever seen the Last Samurai? The movie deals with this Satsuma Rebellion, with Tom Cruise fighting for the wrong side. He longed for the rest of his life to die in the service of the empire, to die in the service of the emperor, to expunge this shame. In 1904, as he and the Third Army, the Third Japanese Army, are being ferried across to Manchuria to fight in the Russo-Japanese War, Nogi pens a funerary poem for himself, but also poems for his two sons. Both sons die in the Russo-Japanese War, but Nogi survives. He's the hero of Port Arthur. He's feted as a national hero, but still haunted. On the day of the Meiji Emperor's funeral, Nogi and his wife commit suicide. Now, that this trend was there, was present, doesn't make Japan's national self-destruction inevitable. For much in the 19-teens and 1920s, Japan was what we call China now, a responsible stakeholder in the international system, kept these militaristic inclinations in check. But beginning with the Great Depression, Japan experiences a perfect storm. The Meiji generation of Genro has died off, leaving lesser men at the helm of state. What capable bureaucrats and civilian officials there were increasingly cowed by a radicalized ultranationalist military that staged coups and assassinations throughout the 20s and 30s. Finally, we have economic crises and resource concerns, and looming security threats, both real and perceived, on every front. What we see in the 1930s and 1940s is this Bushido culture, this martial tradition, seemingly unfettered by any strategic or political constraints or considerations. During the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army became increasingly bogged down in an indecisive war in China, where, by their own admission, they were afflicted with victory disease. The impulse to go further militarily, to build on every operational success without regard to its strategic or political implications. A disastrous border war with the Soviet Union followed in the summer of 1939. And you start to see here a pathology in modern Japanese strategic thinking, military thinking. I don't know if it's even strategic. Japan had taken Korea in that war against Russia to preserve its own security. It then moved into Manchuria to defend Korea. It then moved into China and fought a war against the Soviets to defend Manchuria. As this was going on in the late 30s, a passage from the Book of Five Rings began to resonate within the Japanese military. Musashi says, in large-scale military science, if there is a total deadlock, no progress is being made, many men are being lost, it is essential to stop right away and seize victory by taking advantage of a tactic unsuspected by the enemy. To resolve the war in China, to solve their resource concerns, the Japanese decided to move south. Since that meant almost inevitable war with the United States, the tactic unsuspected by the enemy was the attack on Pearl Harbor. The wisdom and rationales behind the surprise attack are the fodder of great debate among students, especially as it forces them to look at a defining moment in American military history from the perspective of the enemy. Moreover, the lead-up to Pearl Harbor highlights the difficulties inherent in trying to deter, contain, or even predict the behavior of an adversary whose strategic inclinations, cost-benefit calculations are almost completely alien to your own. Finally, the elephant in the room with modern Japanese military history is the role that suicide played as both a social norm and as a military tactic. Obviously, this is an exceedingly sensitive topic, and I leave it up to you how or whether or not you can raise this with your student. But that said, no other historical case is as rich for comparison and contrast than the case of modern Japan, compared and contrasted with modern suicide terrorism. These three cases hopefully will whet your appetite and grab the attention of your students. I consciously chose one from the ancient, one from the medieval, and one from the modern to try to fit in with the sweep of a world historical approach, but ones that could be, cut and pasted into more narrowly historical focused curricula. As I noted before, these three cases exemplify distinct traditions. It is not an exhaustive list of those traditions, and experiences within the larger history of war in the East. They are the glimpse of the past and might be a glimpse of the contentious future of the region. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. We'll take questions. Just turn up your 10 card if you'd like to pose a question. The first question goes to Paul Dicklett.
China has traditionally not sought expansion beyond its historical borders, nor interfered with treatment of its diaspora population. Does the future hold more of the same, or do you see a new transformation based on your current research?
Great question. Obviously, back in the Cold War, many people were concerned about the Chinese diaspora being some sort of fifth column. They were in Malaya, but not really directed by Beijing. The Chinese will tell you that. They have not sought expansions at the expense of their neighbors, and have not meddled in the affairs of Chinese overseas. That's patently false. We have this notion of, and the Chinese will reinforce this, that we have a defensive strategic culture. We read Sun Tzu. We would prefer to win without fighting. Look at that Great Wall we built. That's a defensive measure. Well, you have to build a Great Wall because you've expanded so much at the expense of the steppe nomads that they're really angry at you. In addition, archaeological evidence, if you think nothing's new in Chinese history, 5,000 years, archaeological evidence seems to point to the fact that the Chinese use their skills in wall building. They have a lot of manpower, a lot of materiel. They would go out and build a wall and use their infantry armies to flush the native population out or exterminate them. And you see archaeologically the walls are moving further and further out. So China has a rich tradition of offensive and expansive use of the military. The fact that they tell themselves that they don't might in fact force them to hold their hand, but the Chinese think of defense as we would think of offense. Taiwan, for the Chinese, is an internal problem. It is our sovereign territory. If it sought to, secede, we would be fighting a war to defend our territorial integrity. It would require offensive operations, but it would be strategically and politically defensive. So China does, in fact, have a rich tradition, and my heartburn when I go to China and I hear these arguments being made is that I want to say, no, your history's not like that. But I think they've sort of rhetorically talked themselves into a corner on this, and that might stay their hand a little bit. As far as with the overseas population, beginning in the late 19th century, the Chinese state, actually the Qing dynasty, was very interested in connecting with these people. First, for almost purely mercenary reasons, to get their money, because they make money. They're overseas to make money. Let's get them to send some of that stuff back. Let's get them to use their Western educations and experience to come help enrich China and develop China. They're certainly doing that. I don't see much in the way of an active campaign now to leverage the overseas Chinese community. But at the same time, Chinese living overseas, especially those holding mainland passports, are probably in close contact with party officials and handlers and things like that, developing intelligence. Not in any, just as you would expect. I'm not saying the entire population is, but it's certainly a cause for concern.
I guess I was thinking more in terms of recent 20th century where, Chinese populations overseas have sometimes been attacked, they've even been massacred.
Oh, yeah.
And China's not, done anything militarily in response.
Has not done anything militarily in response. And this came up at a conference I was at last year with a Chinese admiral, and he pointed out that it was very embarrassing for the Chinese that they could not do what we call a NEO, non-combatant evacuation operation. Something terrible happens in Indonesia or some island in the Pacific, and you need to get Chinese expatriates out of there. The Chinese don't have the capability to do that. They need the help of the Singaporean Navy, the United States Navy. It's kind of embarrassing for them. The fact that they did not respond with their military assets in the aftermath of the Indonesian tsunami in 2004. And they watched India and Japan get a lot of praise for their response. And this admiral says, well, we'd like to develop those capabilities, maybe build helicopter carriers and things like that, so we can do these non-combatant evacuation operations and help these people out, because it's a slight to our prestige not to be able to do that.
We have a question from Nicole Roper from West Catholic High School in Philadelphia.
I was interested, you were talking with the Mongols and how they were cosmopolitan and how they seemed to like the artistic idea, with the exception of maybe Korea. When they went in and invaded, they seemed to basically throw all of their traditions out the window and said, you're going to be like us or forget it. Is there a particular reason why they chose that approach with Korea and not so much with other places in Asia?
Well, the simple answer is that the more trouble you gave the Mongols, the less they liked you, and the less they were inclined to let your civilization survive. The old thing goes, they would if you surrendered immediately, if they demanded your surrender, you surrendered, everything was fine. You'd pay tribute, you'd become a part of the Mongol state. If you resisted, you would be destroyed. It's the Carthaginian solution. The Koreans were a case in point. The Southern Song dynasty, which stood up for more than 40 years, the society was not exterminated after the conquest, but the Southern Song, the resistors, were treated as essentially fourth or fifth class citizens. Did not get anywhere near the privileges. Even though Chinese from North China that had been part of the Jin dynasty, actually Jurchen dynasty that the Mongols had conquered, were fully incorporated and had a different status than the Southern. So it wasn't necessarily the civilization, it was how these states had resisted or tried to get in the way of the Mongol conquest.
Okay, we have a question from Gary Souza at Tabor Academy in Massachusetts.
Hey, Gary.
I know that you've done a lot of traveling in Asia, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it seems to me that Asian memory in terms of military warfare runs very deep, much deeper than Western memory in the region, obviously, because there's a lot more to remember, thousands of years rather than hundreds. In a kind of opening of globalization, internationalism, World Bank membership, UN membership, where it seems difficult, at least for me and for possibly the Western mind, to imagine conflict of the same nature that would occur between, say, another invasion of China into Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't try it now because they're looking for the Olympics. Is that a naive perspective? Is thousands of years of Asian history and rivalry deeper than this current trend of internationalism?
Deeper than the blessings of globalization?
Do we have more to worry about than I am?
Well, some people said that about, Germany and Great Britain, each other's best trading partners in the early 20th century. Globalization is fraught with challenges for the Chinese state. It becomes much more beholden to the good graces of states like, Iran, sources of their light sweet crude that they like so much. So that might add to their insecurity. I think, actually, the vast majority of Chinese see the world in very positive terms. Nothing terribly bad has happened to China in the last 20 years or so. Tiananmen Square was bad, but it wasn't terribly bad. They recovered from it. And lots of good things have happened. So the world seems to be moving positively in the Chinese direction. But you raised the question of history. And history figures very prominently in the modern Chinese identity. An interpretation of history informs modern Chinese nationalism, which is a very negative form of nationalism. It's a nationalism of victimization. Victimization at the hands of Great Britain, France, the United States to a lesser extent, and especially Japan. A century and a half of humiliation. That animosity and that sense of victimization runs very deep and has been used by the state to deflect attention from other pressing internal problems, to help cohere the population. But it's not purely, it's not pure manipulation by the state. This runs very deep within the Chinese population. And probably the biggest sticking point is it comes up in relations with Japan. The historical memory in China and what is published in school textbooks in Japan are radically different. The Japanese are working to deal with that historical memory, but nonetheless, you guys familiar with the Yasukuni Shrine? It's a shrine to Japanese war heroes. And when Prime Minister Koizumi visits it, it creates tremendous uproar because it seems like rather than simply honoring the dead, he is honoring the missions that they were on, honoring Japan's imperial moment. Attached, right next to the Yasukuni Shrine, is a museum called the Yushikan. And this museum here is absolutely magnificent, beautifully done. The Yushikan is as well done a museum. It's very professional, it's beautiful, the facility is great. The message is evil. There are explanations of the war in China in the 1930s as a counter-terrorist operation. The war in Korea in 1894-95 is heralded as a turning point in Asian history because it once and for all liberated the Korean people. That is a problematic historical memory. The Chinese also have very stark and in some cases unrealistic historical memory, as I was mentioning before. And this leads to a tremendous amount of conflict between the two. There are also resource issues that come up between China and Japan, especially over the East China Sea, the delineation of where the actual shelf is and where national territory comes to an end, which could make for military competition because, this is something at the War College we call the Galtieri solution. You've got riots in the streets of Buenos Aires. Hey, look, the Falklands. You try to deflect attention, or the Malvinas, sorry. You try to deflect attention from a domestic crisis, and there's certainly possibilities of that happening. But while the globalization has essentially been good for China, this historical memory figures very prominently and makes it problematic.
Okay, we have a question from Ben King, Reynoldsburg High School in Ohio.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you could comment on some developments in the Chinese Navy. Is there a blue water submarine force being developed, and how about amphibious capabilities?
There's a great book called China's Future Nuclear Submarine Force from U.S. Naval Institute Press, which CFR has declared a must-read. The Chinese are investing, I wouldn't say very heavily, but heavily in submarines. Both Russian-produced...
Akulas or?
The Russian-produced Kilos, so the 636, which are diesel-electric submarines. They're also producing their own new generation of diesel-electric submarines. These are, if you're not familiar with a submarine, you run the diesel to charge up the batteries, and then you run silent on the batteries. That's not nearly as good as a nuclear submarine, which you can run silent all the time. And the Chinese are also producing 2 new classes of nuclear submarines, fast attack, the 093 class, and a ballistic missile submarine, the 094. That seems a smart investment. You know, who needs aircraft carriers when you can sink aircraft carriers? It's a great, there's a high degree of uncertainty. It's really hard to find a submarine if it's running on the batteries or silent. And how many have to be in the waters of the Taiwan Strait or in the deep water, or just the edge of the deep water past Taiwan, to make the United States think twice? That's strategic thinking. One thing I've heard from Chinese interlocutors recently is they accuse the United States, especially the U.S. military, of a complete lack of strategic imagination. That we think tactically and operationally. We think in a linear way about war. You get air superiority, sea superiority, you put the forces on the ground, you move across the map to seize the objective, and we translate that into victory. Saddam Hussein's statue comes down, we assume that's victory. We're in Baghdad, we've achieved our objectives. And our apparent inability to reassess. The reason I bring that up, and to think three-dimensionally about war as well, not three-dimensionally in terms of air, land, and sea, but three-dimensionally in terms of the interconnections between tactical, strategic, and operational. It's tactical, operational, and strategic levels of war. They accuse us of a lack of imagination, whereas they are trying to think strategically about Taiwan. We think, well, they can't invade Taiwan. They can't bring, we used to call this the million-man swim. They can't bring sufficient boots across the Taiwan Strait to take Taiwan, therefore it's not a problem. Well, that's thinking operationally, isn't it? What if they, stiff-arm us with those submarines out there? They don't have to be the best submarines in the world. They don't have to be guaranteed carrier killers. But if they stand a chance, that affects our rational calculus, the value of the object of Taiwan. And, well, if the people in Taiwan who are dumb enough to declare independence in the Chinese mindset, they view that as a small minority. The vast majority of people who live on Taiwan want to either go back to the status quo or be part of China. Therefore, people on Taiwan are not really, committed to the cause. Might be a dangerous assumption, but at least it's thinking strategically. And that, given all of that, maybe some precision strikes, maybe dropping a couple of special operations teams might be sufficient. Because as the Sun Tzu says, it's to enhance the wealth and power of the state, to profit, to take all under heaven intact. To take the enemy's state is far better than to destroy it. To take an enemy's army away from him and make it yours is much better than destroying that army. So they certainly think in these terms, but at the same time, I think that is some dangerous assumptions on their part, a simplistic characterization of the United States, our lack of strategic imagination, lack of commitment to Taiwan, and also an excessive faith in what I see as maybe too Sun Tzuian a model. That's what we like to teach at the War College. Sun Tzu, taken to those extremes, seems to write out fog, friction, chance, genius, passion from war. Tries to make it really sterile. Clausewitz, you get marching, moving an army through the terrain, fog, friction, chance, genius. interaction that's big. So maybe it's excessive faith in the power of their own strategic traditions to guide them in the future. Long answer to a question about submarines.
We have several questions, but we'll only be able to take one more question, which I'll give to George Thornton from Oroville High School from the state of Washington.
Thank you for that opportunity. In my travels in China, one of the concepts that was impressed upon me by the long history of China was the idea of the concept of mandate from heaven. Mm-hmm. And I was curious as to whether you see it as a rationalization that could force China to turn to facing their internal structural and social issues, and that tempering their potential military adventurism.
Mm-hmm. The concept of mandate of heaven goes back, it's actually a conceit invented by the founders of the Zhou dynasty to justify their overthrow of the preceding dynasty. They say, look, there's famine, there's plague, these guys are sitting around in their palaces with their concubines and their dinner parties. They've lapsed into corruption and self-centeredness. And we can see in the world these plagues and the earthquakes and things like that, dogs, cats living together, plagues, fire, as manifestations, physical manifestations of their corruption. Heaven's unhappy. The Zhou comes in and says, we have heaven's mandate. Heaven, the gods have given us. Our ancestors, who are dead, are the ones first in line talking to the gods. So all's right with the world. Well, this is a justification for revolution in China. It has been repeatedly invoked up until the 20th century. I mean, people have argued that the speed of the collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's regime had as much to do with the military disasters in Manchuria as is in this concept of the mandate of heaven. You wouldn't be losing like that if you had heaven's mandate. You know, and this, some have argued, has led to a pronounced tradition of bandwagoning in Chinese history. The current regime certainly thinks in these terms, less sort of in terms of the divine aspects of it, but certainly the legitimacy of the regime is tied up in its ability to continue to provide opportunities for the Chinese people to better their lives. And it's also a regime that knows full well that the last dynasty, and then Chiang Kai-shek's government, you know, the Qing dynasty in particular, collapsed not merely, you know, from the internal contradictions, but also a series of disastrous foreign wars. A war in Korea totally undermined the legitimacy of the state. Lost at Taiwan. The next war in Korea did a lot of violence to the Chinese state. Lost in Taiwan again. Well, they didn't really have the means to take it by force, but you know, we could say lost in Taiwan. So they're very much aware of the dangers of the Galtieri solution, of trying to deflect attention away and do those sorts of things, because the legitimacy of the regime is so you know, it's on a razor's edge. And you see this in its consistent attempts to co-opt those elements that might seem to be the greatest threat to them. The engineers and the technocrats in the 60s and 70s, and most recently capitalists. If you're a capitalist, you can become a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Not only capitalism and communism seemingly the antithesis, but also capitalism is inherently parochial. It's local. And, you know, that seems to deflect loyalties away from the state to other pursuits. So if you can't beat them, get them to join you, as it were. So I think that concept, not explicitly, but it certainly plays, and that major blows to the prestige of the state. SARS, the coal mining issue that's going on right now, simply they do not have the control of the countryside to stop illegal coal mining, and the profit motive is so great out there. That's a nationwide crisis in China, trying to manage that. And also, most recently, the scandals about in the Food and Drug Administration, leading them to ostentatiously execute the head of the FDA.
I think equally, you got to consider their growing issues with pollution. Is that something they're going to have to turn to mind to also?
Yeah. Mainland China is fraught. Anyone who's ever been there, anyone who's ever been in Beijing on a summer's day, When I lived there, we joked that this is a city that made its own gravy when it rained. Just the sludge, the gobi dust, and these are huge problems. Water is an incredibly huge issue in China. The water table in North China, so much violence has been done to the water table in North China. These are monumental problems. But again, with China and Asia in general, you got to think about scale. We think about a flood. We think about Katrina, national disaster. There's a flood in China, you get 3 million refugees, simply because there's so many people. And we're talking about such large areas. So you'd say, oh my God, 3 million refugees. This place is on the verge of collapse. But no. But the regime is definitely concerned about those issues, and the environment, the economy, all figure very prominently in those concerns. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Questions than we were able to handle, but there'll always be more time later. Break now, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.